Kate, welcome to the Caregivers Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kate, I'd like to begin with this. Some caregivers have a terrifying thought. They ask themselves, is this a life sentence? Is this something that's only going to end with the death of me or them? Did you ever have that thought?
I did, actually. Yes. As you know, I was caring for my then husband. This was a number of years ago now, but he actually received more than one terminal diagnosis. And at many points, I was told he was very likely to die, even outside of those terminal diagnoses. And I thought that it would likely end that way. But on occasion, I did feel it might end in my own, if not death, needing to abandon the situation. I felt trapped and like I might need to run away. And I think for many caregivers, the scenario you just pointed out is all too real. There's no end, sadly, except in death. I was fortunate that my husband and my kid's father survived, but it was still a long and challenging road.
So before anyone even called you a caregiver, before there were forms and labels sort of assigned, what was happening sort of in your life that made you realize something fundamental was shifting before you and that your role as a partner was just never going to be the same?
Well, there were a series of moments where it kind of sank in, or where I knew things or got that sense that something was happening and something was really changing. And when I look back, I had no idea that I was becoming a caregiver in my first act and moment as a caregiver, but it's so vivid to me. Um, and this was in the fall of 2014. Our younger child, our daughter, was just starting kindergarten, and I've been a freelance writer my whole career. So when she was starting kindergarten, I was like, I have made it. I'm going to have time to work on projects, all kinds of things. Like my care responsibilities felt like they were easing up. And that very day, I was working at this little desk I had in the kitchen, and my husband, who always wore a beard, and also who had lost maybe 30 pounds off not a very large frame over the preceding 6 months, came into the kitchen, and he had his hands on his jaw, and he said, "I have these funny lumps. It might just be from like taking a hockey puck to the face pretty earlier in life, but do you think I should get them checked out by the doctor?" And I said, "Yes, I think you should go to the doctor," because I thought the weight loss is weird. He was like falling asleep reading books to our kids and thought these are strange. And I said, "You should definitely go to the doctor." And I was unaware that that was my first act as his caregiver. But looking back, that's what it was. And then there was a long period of limbo where we heard from doctors, "We don't think this is anything, but if you really want, we'll check it out. If you insist, we'll biopsy. If you insist, next steps, next steps, next steps." And it took 6 months to get a diagnosis of a very rare form of lymphoma that he had, and even longer than that before he started treatment. Um, the moment, the moment of his diagnosis, I knew things were changing irrevocably. But the real moment that was the absolute turning point, where it was a sudden emergency and a shock, was all the way in May of that next year. So May of 2015, he'd had a cough. There was a long we'd gotten second opinions. There was a long, like, how do we treat this? There's not any data on this particular form. We don't even have a name for this form. The insurance had turned down one chemo option. So we were waiting and in limbo. And it was a Saturday evening, and I just ripped out the last of the winter garden, because I live in California, and put in the summer garden that day. And it was the first really hot day of the spring. And I was putting dinner on the table with the last of those vegetables from the garden. And he called from the bathroom, "Come here right now." And truth be told, I was a little irritated because nobody was coming to the table. My kids were dilly-dallying, and I thought he was dilly-dallying. Well, it turned out he was in the bathroom coughing up blood, and that a lung tumor that nobody knew about had ruptured. And I called a neighbor to sit with the kids and drove him to the hospital and drove through the red lights. Fortunately, we're a mile from the hospital. And that was the moment when it was like, oh, everything has truly
Massive
changed.
hemoptysis will do that, won't it?
Jeez. Yes. And I want to kind of draw a point to that where it's like, I kind of experienced both ways that people enter into caregiving, which I think is, on the one hand, it's often unawares, like the slow slide. People notice that mom or
Mm-hmm.
dad isn't remembering things. They take them to the doctor, and before they know it, they are really involved in care. And it's that slow kind of entry unwittingly, or the emergency. And I had a taste of both, which I think is, probably not as unusual as I think it is. But, very few people enter into caregiving eyes wide open, knowing like this is a path I have chosen. And I think it makes it really a lot harder, both in practical ways and in emotional ways, that there's not that, it's not like a job you've applied for and been interviewed for and you know what you're getting into.
No.
Um,
and you went through this sort of indolent phase, to use a popular term, as a caregiver, and then this sort of abrupt awakening. And that
Yeah.
was, before you probably maybe even understood what branding as a caregiver is. But at that point, or soon thereafter, that notion of being a caregiver, and ultimately you had a caregiving assessment done. I think you were working with an app or some sort of questionnaire, and you had this assessment. What did it suddenly feel like? Oh my God, my life's being translated into a scoring system.
Yeah, that was more than a year later, after the emergency, the hemoptysis that I just described. And Brad, my then husband, had gone through, intensive chemo, a relapse, and then a very difficult stem cell transplant. So just to frame that, and he had come home needing round-the-clock care, which we had to hire in-home caregivers to help me with. And even though we had round-the-clock in-home caregivers, my role caring for him was still, a full-time job and then some. And in a doctor's
Absolutely.
appointment that I took him to, the doctor looked at me because I was just weeping. I had kind of broken down. Because when he came home from the hospital, he'd been in the hospital for over 4 months. And I thought things, the hospital was as hard as it could get, but it turned out having a very needy patient at home, needing round-the-clock care, also with 2 small children in the summer when school was out, was significantly harder. And I was already pretty much at the end of my rope. And so I started crying in this doctor's appointment. I just was like looking down, just weeping, 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 which is not like me. And the doctor knew it was not like me. And he looked at me and he's like, are you taking care of yourself? Because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of him. And then I turned really quickly to feeling mad because I felt like I don't have time to take care of myself. I barely have time to take care of all the other people who need care in my life. But I went home and I was dutifully thinking like, okay, I gotta look for something. So I started to Google looking for like caregiver support groups. And what popped up in the Google auto populates a search was caregiver burnout. And there was a quiz and I clicked on that and I took it. And when I was finished with the quiz, the answer was, it popped up with a picture of a burnt piece of bread and it said, you're already toast. And then it had some description of, all the ways you had already reached burnout. And I thought, oh boy. First of all, I love the phrase. So I think at the time tweeted like, oh, well, I found the title of my caregiving memoir, which it did eventually become the title of my caregiving memoir. But I also thought like, well, where do I go from there? I'm already toast. This quiz has told me, and I can't remember. It wasn't a scientific assessment, but it was the kind of assessment that honestly I think should be included in treatment plans for patients to assess where their caregivers are. I think that something like that looks at, the mental, physical, and emotional health of caregivers, would go a long way even toward helping see caregivers as an important part of, of patient care and of including them in the process and making sure that they're coping well enough to continue the work that's really essential for patient's well-being.
So tell me, what if you had done that quiz or questionnaire 1 year before? How do you think you would have scored?
I can't remember what the other metrics were, but I don't think I would have been at that already toast point. I was, after that emergency, Brad did spend almost 3 weeks in the hospital. At that point, his lung collapsed. He needed this emergency chemo. And so he came home from that also on oxygen, needing IV antibiotics through a PICC line, which I was sort of trained to give very hastily, and which came as a big shock to me that I was doing these medical tasks. And that was the first moment I really realized that those are really routinely expected of family caregivers nowadays. But I think I would have scored somewhere before burnout, but in a look out and, make sure you have all the support you can get. You're asking for all the help you need and trying to take time for yourself. I mean, honestly, though, the demands ultimately of his illness, of the crisis of his illness, and I know this is the case for many family caregivers, were so extreme that, self-care was not enough of a prescription. And we did have, family support. His parents came from Canada, lived with us, helped with our children, family, friends. There was there was a period of months when, every meal was delivered through a meal train, a friend or an acquaintance, or in a couple of places, even strangers who, had heard about our story and, from a friend and wanted to help. So I feel like we had excellent community and a lot of support, and I had a lot of privileges in other ways that I'm happy to talk about, but still the demands of caregiving through a really devastating illness and what, to me, the medical establishment expected patients to have available to them at home, i.e., literal 24-hour care where you never take your eyes off a very ill patient, is not realistic, not feasible for many families. And part of the reason I wrote my book is because I thought, if I have all of these advantages, if I have so much help, financial resources, live close to the hospital, have, enough education to be able to talk to the doctors and understand what's going on, you know, I I didn't have a job. I was a freelance writer, so I could stop working, though that wasn't, great for the bottom line. But I had all those advantages, and I was still drowning and getting to the point of becoming already toast. What must it be like for most people? Like what kind of crisis in family care are we facing, and what does that do both to the caregivers themselves and also to ultimately the outcomes of patients and the people we love and who we want to care for, but have a really hard time doing so sustainably in this system.
Well, a couple of things I hear there is that, you know, you stumbled across that online assessment, but really what our listeners need to be aware of is you need to ask yourself those questions. You need to take an inventory early on
Hmm.
because, like you said, when someone said, you really need to take care of yourself, they told you way at the wrong time. That's what you need to hear at the beginning. And I'm really struck by you're comprehensively resourced, very capable, and told you need to be there 24/7, which was probably one of the most overwhelming things you've ever heard. But there's a range of different people in different family situations, different financial situations, and everybody's getting that same message. I can't fathom the catastrophic feelings some early caregivers must feel when faced with that.
Hmm.
Do you think that's
Hmm.
just a rubber stamp approach of the medical establishment? It's like, that's it? Or did they have confidence in you that was beyond the norm?
I think, they had confidence in me. I think, and I should clarify, the hospital and the physicians and the nurses, all the people who treated my husband were outstanding. They unquestionably saved his life. I don't question their medical, skill and devotion to their work and to patient well-being and all of those things. But I'm first of all, I or any caregiver, I'm not their patient. they're looking at a patient who has very high needs, and at home, when that patient is at home, they can't do anything. It's a bit out of sight, out of mind. And I think, there were occasions where people were out of touch with the demands that were being placed, upon me or upon the care system. Like when he went home from the stem cell transplant, he was on IV nutrition, which was a quite complicated process to set up. And at one point, an older physician said, "Oh, it's not that big a deal. You just plug it in." Many of my patients do it themselves, and it's like, well, once I got good at it, it took me 20 minutes to half an hour. It was complicated. It was tricky. I might point out also at the time, my husband had lost his vision. He was blind and unable to walk unassisted. So it was not a matter of him plugging it in. It was me very carefully without medical training, so I was nervous about doing all of these things, trying to learn to, not harm him in the course of caring for him. And I think, I'm speaking from within the US context, and there's, we have obviously a range of for-profit and nonprofit healthcare. The health insurance landscape is very fractured. There's all kinds of bureaucratic and financial considerations, and there's been a huge hospital-to-home movement, which I think is wonderful for many patients, but also not coincidentally really improves the bottom line and cuts costs for hospitals and medical systems and insurers. And I think that there's a lot that has gotten shunted onto family caregivers, both in terms of like the complexity of medical tasks and the complexity of care that's expected of us, of them, since I'm no longer in that role at this time. And in terms of financial and time resources, that is a function of cuts to the medical establishment. And then it's like, well, somebody has to pick up the slack, and there's an assumption that you'll do it. And it goes in like from large to small. Like there's such a huge range of the ways this can function, even something as small as, follow-up appointments, when they call you and they tell you like, oh, well, you'll be seen at 3:00 for this, Tuesday for this essential thing. It's like, well, actually, I have two small children and I need to pick them up from school at 3:00. But there's not is it okay if it's at 3:00? It's that's when it is. You figure it out if it doesn't work for you. And then that ramifies across dozens of large and small complications, because care is, I think of necessity, patient-centered, and doctors are under a huge amount of pressure. The system is under a huge amount of pressure. And I think caregivers are often unwittingly caught in that bind. I do think are hopeful signs and some hopeful movements in the 10 years or, nearly a decade since I was really in the trenches of that. I've seen movements toward more involvement of caregivers, more inclusion. I think the pandemic showed a lot of people in the medical, like revealed kind of culturally to a lot of people how essential caregivers are when we saw, the effects on, for instance, older folks in care homes when their caregivers couldn't see them, couldn't be with them, and how devastating that was, and how much it affected their care. There was some light shined on both the plight of the caregiver and also how essential that is to good patient care. And so I've seen things like there are now some caregiver clinics, or caregivers are more included in patient assessments in small things, especially I think in the dementia care communities here in the U.S. The Veterans Administration has led in some like caregiver, pro caregiver movements. There are hopeful signs, despite it still being, I think, a difficult climate in any number of ways.
It's interesting because you're right. It's not just plug and play for home TPN. I actually supervise a TPN team here in Ontario, and there's a lot of decision making that goes into whether patients and their caregivers can actually handle home TPN, because there are lots of risk. I always refer to it as home chemotherapy in a way.
Yeah. I mean, it was even just a space issue. Like I needed fridge space. So we were lucky that there was like a little bar fridge in one part of our house that the previous owners had put in. I was like, well, finally I have a use for this bar fridge. Like, so that nothing is in with, all the, yeah.
So time has passed since those events, but our listeners, I think many are going through various phases of their evolution of their journey as a caregiver. When you think back to those first couple of years, when did you first realize that, ooh, this isn't going to be a short-term crisis? This is growing legs.
Yes, it was really that day or the couple of days following that emergency, the hemoptysis, that I realized that for myself personally. And I don't know if you were asking if it was, for me or for the broader caregiving community. But as I was going through it and starting to talk to more people about it and hearing like, oh, this is not an uncommon story. Every one of the millions of caregiving stories is unique, but it's not uncommon, and they have so many common themes and common challenges. And it was really when I started thinking about working on the book that I initially wrote, that I started asking those questions. Because what I tried to do was write the book that I wanted to read and needed to read about like why I was struggling so much. As I say, at first I was kind of baffled, like, why is this so hard when I have all of this, have all of these advantages? And I thought, like, it must be me. It must be my problem. And I wanted to look at it through a systemic and a cultural lens. And that's kind of what led me to start looking into, like, oh, what are the demands? Like, what are some of the numbers? I have this background not only as a journalist and freelance writer, but also way back before then I was a PhD student in Victorian literature. And so I'd read a lot of books where there were caregivers in the background. And I'd never, like many people, I'd never really noticed that many of the classic literature that I'd loved for a long time were caregiving stories. And so when I revisited those originally, like as comfort reads, when I was, in the thick of things, I started thinking like, oh, there's a whole complex and constellation of cultural assumptions around care, around who we think cares for other people, what they should be doing, how they should be feeling emotionally. I think there's a lot of like emotional pressure to, you know, that you hear all the time. You're so strong. I can't even imagine. You've got to stay positive. There's toxic positivity around it. There's pressure to not feel the, frustration and resentment that caregivers really often feel. And then that produces guilt. So the more I started thinking about it and living it, and then meeting other people who were in similar roles, I started seeing like, oh, this is actually a big and under-recognized cultural phenomenon. And then as I started researching the book, I realized like we are at the cusp of this real care crisis. And there were and continue to be
There were hints
advocacy
then. Yeah.
organizations and places that are looking out for that and really exploring it and sounding the warning bell because um the year my book came out, which was 2021, the first wave of the baby boomers were turning 75. And so the baby boomers, this enormous generation, are entering into old age, which many of them, including, many baby boomers I know and love, do not want to hear that they are old or getting old. But that does necessarily mean that eventually they're going to need more care. And there's not enough of us in the younger generations to do it, either as family caregivers or as paid caregivers and in home care.
Well, it's hitting at numerous levels, and
Hmm.
we're dealing with in Canada, looking at opportunities to incentivize, foreign workers to come, who have skills and expertise in caregiving. And I know there's various initiatives going on in the U.S. and state-specific different initiatives. Um, Difficult to do in an age where the focus of most social media is towards what some people label as toxic individualism,
Yes.
where we need to go
Yes.
back to the notion that it takes a community and a village to caregive just like it does to raise a kid.
Yes.
So take us through the worst days or a worst day. What happens from the moment you open your eyes and wake up?
Mm. I'm going to talk a little bit about February 2016, which was the month where I most thought Brad was going to die. He had his transplant in January of 2016. So the 10th anniversary of that just recently passed. And if all had gone well with the transplant, the minimum he could be in the hospital, or he could have gone home after 30 days. That was like the minimum if all had gone well. But things went terribly. He got a very severe case of like acute graft-versus-host and started losing his vision, started having terrible digestive, like gut health issues that were just awful. And so that month, you know, I was at home with our two kids who were then, they were 10 and 6, and so in 5th grade and 1st grade. So I would get up and I would immediately be thinking about, laundry that I'd brought home from the hospital that I was going to have to bring to the hospital that day. Yeah, I would sometimes, though I didn't do it as much, like try to race off to the gym at 6 in the morning, because my in-laws were living with us for quite some time. So they were in our guest room, so I could leave in the morning. So I had that support, but just to try to get a little exercise or a little time for myself. But then the race would be on to get the girls to school. I knew that I would going to have to leave them in aftercare, which they did not enjoy, and they made that very clear. And of course, they were struggling, and I had them in therapy. And some like support types of groups. There was an art therapy support group that a hospital social worker linked us to. So, and they were still in some activities because I was mindful that this was, their one childhood. So the whole day was about thinking like, how do I get my kids here, gulp down my coffee, get to the hospital with the things Brad needs. When I would get to the hospital, he was essentially usually not really able to talk, carry on a conversation. The kids didn't see him for close to 3 months, and he was also not well enough to talk on the phone. And he'd been a very involved dad, so they missed him terribly. So there was a lot of the kids would be acting out. I was always tired. I was always behind on something, trying to just keep, you know, on top of, I don't know, whatever, even thanking the people who brought us the meal train. At one point, we were getting food and we had to borrow an extra fridge from my next door neighbor because I was trying not to, I was trying to keep all of this food. So there was just always this welter of tasks. There was calling the insurance, making sure that was running. There was getting into the hospital. He was in an isolation room. So when I got to the hospital, I learned all the best routes through the hospital, and I learned where the best coffee cart was and what its hours were. And then I would go up through the little shortcut that I'd found and go up to the little vestibule outside of the room and put on the mask, put on the gown, and, sanitize, go into the room. And usually in the room, he would, sadly be on a commode. He was not able to get to a toilet, but the the gut graft-versus-host disease was terrible. He was in horrible pain with his eyes. His elbows would bleed from the roughness of the hunching on the arms of the commode. And so I would see him, the father of my kids, my husband, in this state that was so painful to witness. And he was in pain. He wasn't, you know, very coherent. And I was also trying to field communications with other people, coordinate with, my in-laws who were incredibly helpful. I don't know how I would have gotten through it without them. And then just like wait, then be in that room, that little stuffy feeling room where he was in pain, waiting and waiting and waiting for the doctors to come on rounds, so that I could find out what was going on, try to advocate, try to get more help. The level of trying to understand the hospital bureaucracy and get different things for all of the different complex of, issues that he had. He was unable to eat. He had terrible mouth sores. He had, there were medications that they wanted to try that he, in his in his, not really understanding fully what was happening, was opposed to. So I was trying to convince him of things. Just that's I've gone on too long, but that gets me to about 10 o'clock in the morning.
Well, that paints the picture, though. And that's 10, exactly. So
Yeah.
just for our listeners, graft-versus-host disease is when you receive a donor bone marrow transplant that is matched as best as it can so that it can grow in your own bone marrow and cure you from your previous disease. Sometimes that bone marrow starts attacking your own body tissues. It can attack the gut. It can attack the skin, the eyes, the liver, all kind of different places. And it's an unfortunate sort of juggling act between you don't want to reject the graft, but you don't want the graft to attack your own body organs. And it's quite the dance. And it's graded in different stages, grade 1, 2, 3, 4. And unfortunately, I think Brad had grade 4.
He had grade 4.
Which is the worst kind.
He had every single type that you just mentioned. It attacked in every single place. And I used to describe it as it's like the reverse of if you get a kidney transplant and your body rejects the kidney. This is your new immune system rejects all of you. And in his case, it was all of him. And, he had a very well-matched, he was a 10 out of 10 match. It was his brother, who's wonderful, was the donor and came down from Canada. And as you say, if to do the donation, and as you say, if the graft fails or if you reject the graft or overcome the graft, the patient dies. They can't be saved because they have no immune system. But also the graft is what is having the cancer fighting effect. So you want a robust graft, but if it's too robust, it in its, rejection of you, that can also kill you. So it was as you say, it was a very challenging dance and balancing act of different medications, some of which would seem to work and then not work anymore, and which are very powerful and very, difficult for the body to handle. So it was a long-standing, and graft-versus-host also comes in two major types: acute, which is like the initial reaction, which he had at that time, and then chronic, where it sort of settles in for the long haul. And he did continue to suffer from, does continue to suffer from chronic graft-versus-host disease. But I will say, and I should say this because there was, a happy ending in that he was able to recover his vision through surgeries. The graft-versus-host is much, much reduced. He's able to live independently. He's doing very, very well and kind of beat all kinds of odds. It was a bit of a miracle in the end.
With a huge collateral effect on people's lives, not only the patients. That's incredible. When you were getting through the rest of your day, I mean, you told us what you got done by 10 o'clock, which sounds like more than many people get done in a week. What, if you stopped, what would be the crucial thing that there wouldn't even be anybody to step in to do if you weren't there? Like, would things just sort of implode?
I thought they would. I'm not sure that they would have, because we did have, support from Brad's mom and dad. But I did feel like that liaison of talking to all the doctors, and he was in a teaching hospital also, so there were lots of residents and a big team involved in the care. And so for me, I felt like kind of the glue. I often felt like I was playing Twister and reaching behind one and, reaching in all kinds of ways to catch all the necessary dots. But I did feel that being just kind of the glue of communication and making sure the different teams were talking to each other, which was often very difficult. This is, by the by, but getting ophthalmology support was very challenging because nobody was used to working with the ophthalmology team. Because if you think about how rare it is that a patient comes into an oncology unit and then loses their vision on the oncology unit, that was not like a well-oiled machine between the
Right.
two of them. So just trying to make things happen. But then there were also all the pieces of our lives that had to go on. The thing that would have collapsed without me was also paying the mortgage, paying the bills, filling out the field trip forms for my kids to go to, to like the things they needed to go to school, making sure that they had that poster board for that, that last minute project that I didn't know about until 2 nights before it was due.
That's right.
Because all of that stuff didn't stop either, and I did kind of pull back on some of their activities, but like, those things don't stop. And I wanted them to feel like they were still, you know, they were still important, obviously, but those kind of just the nexus of things. And, I should say, one of the things that it actually revealed to me doing this was that I'd been carrying by far the bulk of the mental load and all of that household labor all along, because subtracting Brad from that equation, like his illness added very greatly to my challenges, but it didn't add that much to like thinking about like, oh, is it time to get Nora, our older daughter, new size shoes and then, to hand me down the next ones to her little sister and clear out the closet, and like all of those kind of like constant mental wheels that we're turning that, what they now call mental load or invisible labor, those were still ongoing. And I realized like, oh, I was doing most of that already. It just added a huge new component to that of like always having to, think about, do I need to take more grippy socks into the hospital? Or later when Brad was learning to eat again, we had a lot of challenges with like the hospital food. So I was making like, broth to take in to try to help him eat. And because there came a point when it was clear that if he didn't start eating again, he wouldn't be able to survive. So trying to, coordinate those teams, all of those things. So such a it's part of, I think that's one of the challenges is that caregiving there's no very clear job description. And for a lot of people, you know, it took me a long time to even identify as a caregiver. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And then it took me a long time to realize, like, oh, all those things I'm doing when I'm, opening those explanation of benefits and checking them over and making sure that, like, we don't owe money and that I call the health insurance or I call the home nurse to schedule it. That's caregiving. Like posting we kept a blog to keep people informed because so many people were wanted to know what was happening to their friend, their family member, cousin, everything, but I didn't have time to text everyone back, so we kept that. Communicating with people, that's caregiving. Keeping the home front warm as it were before the person comes home or when they're back, that's caregiving too. And I think we underestimate a lot of aspects of caregiving and reassurance and emotional, support for the person who's sick. That's obviously also caregiving, not just the hands-on act of, helping somebody out of bed or activities of daily living like showering or something.
The amount of resilience and adaptability and persistence that it takes for caregiving is remarkable. And caregiving has such a big funnel entrance. I mean, so many different people get funneled into the caregiver role, and their aptitude, their ability, their strength, their coping skills are all variable. And we can understand how different the story is, but there needs to be a place for stories to be told. When you hit true caregiver burnout,
Mhm.
can you take us to that moment when you just you would have given everything to just escape your life? What was
Ooh.
happening that day in that moment where you just sort of threw your arms up and said, I just can't be here anymore?
Oh boy. I actually remember one in particular. This was a few weeks after Brad had come home from the hospital, and we had a home rehab team for him because he needed occupational therapy, physical therapy. They included a social worker. There was a nutritionist. There were some other team members. I can't even remember what, but we had in-home caregivers. We had, lots of people visiting because now he was able to be seen and talked to, and he needed that social connection and to re-enter the world. But the upshot of that was that the home that had been the place where I went to lie down and maybe cry or maybe just zone out in front of the TV or whatever and have some quiet and a little bit of space to myself was now no longer my own. It was a healthcare facility, and there were people in and out all day long, every day. And there was a day when the physical therapist, who was very well meaning and very good at her job, but she had a spouse who had also had a bone marrow transplant, a stem cell transplant. And he had not had nearly as challenging a time as Brad had. He had sailed through it more easily. And it's never easy. There's no such thing as an easy bone marrow transplant, but his had been less devastating than Brad's. And she finished her work with him, and she called me in from the kitchen, and it was maybe 9 or 10 a.m. It was at 10 a.m. I'd already been up for 4 hours. I'd taken the kids to summer camp. I'd done 2 loads of laundry. I'd paid bills. I'd made calls. I'd gulped some coffee, but probably not breakfast. And there were like 3 other people to have appointments with Brad, and I knew visitors that day and all kinds of things. And she calls me in, and it was also a June day in my home of Sacramento, and the high was going to be 106 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was a bit of a pressure cooker there. And she calls me in and she says, "You really should be making your husband bone broth." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "Bone broth is very healing for the gut, and he needs that, and you need to be making him bone broth for his healing." And I was like, "You're the physical therapist. You're not the nutritionist." And she's like, "Well, I made it for my husband. And, it was really helpful to him." And I was like, "Why don't you stick to your job?" I was not, I got very clipped and very like, and I was really mad immediately. And I will also add that part of this and part of the reason I felt so unseen and angry at this is that my professional background is as a food writer. And I had made him bone broth when he was in the hospital. And I had even one of the only little pieces of work that I'd managed to do in months, maybe a year, was write a short thing for a local magazine on where to get stewing hens, like the old-fashioned kind of chicken that make the best of that kind of broth because they're older and their bones have more of the essential, proteins and so on, and you can long cook them. So I'd actually written something and I was like, "I'm actually a little bit of a subject matter expert on this, and you are, not mansplaining, but whatever splaining to me about doing this. And also, it's none of your business. And also, I'm already completely overwhelmed. And I don't want to start a pot of bone broth on a 106-degree summer day when I have 20 other things on my to-do list." And so I got very cranky with her, and she was like, "Well, there's no need to, no need to be like that." And the
Boom.
next person that was up was the social worker. And I actually stormed out of the house. I slammed the door and I took a very fast walk around the block and was just like, I may have screamed a little bit while I was walking around, but I was furious. And when I got back, the social worker who was there really to talk to Brad was kind of like, "Maybe today I should talk to you." And I was like, "I think that would be a good idea." That was kind of around the
Wow.
time of that Already Toast quiz, maybe a little before. But I just felt so completely like not a person in my life. And
Oh,
I
absolutely.
felt like I was just a factotum doing everything for other people. And there were other moments where you know, medical people would see Brad's name in the chart and address me as Mrs. his last name, and I'd never changed my name, and I was like, "That's not my name," but things where I felt so overlooked and unseen and felt like, I'm a person, I deserve to live my life. I have a professional life. I have friends. I have kids. I have a whole complex of things besides being a vending machine dispensing homemade bone broth. That isn't, that you're not when the nutritionist tells me, then she and I, we can talk about it. But that was kind of the moment of a moment of very bad vibes. Let's put it that way.
Well, I'm hearing is you were still functioning, but you weren't really yourself. But
No, I
did it
was
come
not.
to a point where you just had to go numb just to survive?
I think that point, I was pretty numb for a lot of 2016, to be honest with you. 2016 was kind of our Annus Horribilis, um,
Yeah.
where it just felt like one thing after another. And even after he was home and doing better, then he had a second form of cancer that was a complication of the transplant, and eventually had to go to to do a clinical trial in New York for a month. And when he did that, that was actually that month started to bring me back to myself somewhat, because his parents very kindly and very generously offered. They said I could choose whether I would go to New York and be with him, because he was blind. He couldn't have navigated things on his own, and very severely immune compromised still. And he needed to be at Sloan Kettering in New York for a month. And they said it was for the entire month of December, and he was coming home after Christmas. And his parents offered, they said, you can either go with him to New York, and we'll come out and stay with the girls, or we'll go with him to New York and you can stay home with the girls. And I chose to stay home with the kids and have a break from the caregiving. And it was partly for the girls' sake, because I thought they needed a parent after everything they'd been through that year, but I needed time that was not in that medical setting. But I did go numb, and I think a lot of it was self-protective. I expected to be widowed, and so I was like kind of pulling back emotionally from the relationship. But also there wasn't, when with somebody who's so ill and is changing because of the illness, it's very difficult to keep that kind of connection that you have with a spouse, if not impossible. And so I went numb in a lot of ways, and it was the only coping mechanism that I could muster a lot of the time, but it was often not a good coping mechanism. And I'll also say that, sometimes I numbed out with like a drink or two or three after dinner, because that was the way to like just shut down from it. And that's very common with caregivers, and very, it's maladaptive, but I try to look back and forgive myself, because sometimes there's not a lot of other coping mechanisms out there.
Going back to that time in your story, you wrote like after your partner's transplant at the time, that you wrote that the man you loved almost felt like a stranger,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that's almost someone else came home in his body, or he was still in there hidden somewhere, but there was a new body that he had to
Hmm.
contend with. What's it like to grieve someone or the loss of someone when they're still alive?
It's very hard. I felt incredibly guilty, for starters, and it was very hard for both of us. Of course, like, he had suffered. I don't want to discount the fact that he had suffered immense
Hmm.
trauma. And so he was trying to cope with his new body and his new self. And I know that that's a process that, for him and for millions of other survivors of cancer and other ailments, is still ongoing. Um And a lot of times the things we needed and wanted at those times were really at cross purposes. It was really difficult, especially because the expectation was like, you must be over the moon that he's doing better, that he's home, you know, that he's back. And I felt like he was sort of back, but not really back. And we had different approaches to like how we wanted to repair, how we wanted to reintegrate into, our lives. There was only so much he could take on in terms of, parenting, um, all kinds of intimacy, emotional and physical, were enormous challenge. And it just really, I think, permanently altered the marriage. I mean, I know permanently, because ultimately we tried a lot of couples counseling and talking and working through and trying to repair things, and came to the conclusion that we weren't suited any longer to being married, and we weren't going to recover the marriage we had, and didn't have the capacity to build a new one that served us both in the ways that we changed after this ordeal. That was like, and it's also strange, so strange and disorienting to go through an ordeal with somebody and realize that you went through the same the same series of events, but it was a completely different experience and completely different ordeal for both of you. So it's like you're talking to each other from a foreign country, even though it looks like you're in the same place.
When relationships rely on connection and the illness and the caregiving role seem to be just fertile grounds for disconnection, I can appreciate how much that challenge, as you expressed it, just comes to the forefront. When we think of caregiving generations ago, when it was duty-based,
Hmm.
and you could be completely disconnected, but it was your duty, and that's what kept two people together, you could see where it might take on a more seamless process. But life's different today. We want connection. We need connection. We seek out connection in our relationships. We have different expectations of ourselves and our partners in our relationships.
Yeah.
And from what you're describing, it's the perfect storm.
It was a bit of a perfect storm, and I would also, we seek connection, we seek mutual support in partnerships, and one of the distinct challenges of spousal or partner caregiving is that you lose your primary support person as you are caring for them because they cannot offer you support because you are supporting them. And, of
And you
course,
witness that loss.
yeah, you experience and witness that loss, and of course, there's role reversals or relational challenges in any caregiving. An adult child caring for a parent, obviously the roles reverse, and that's also psychologically really and emotionally really really hard. I mean, I would also point out that aside from duty, one of the things that often kept people in care relationships in generations and decades and centuries past um, is a lack of other options. Caregiving is often very gendered, though, which is not to say
Hmm.
there aren't millions and millions of amazing male caregivers out there, but the care expectations on women are different. And one of the things that I found and was interested in my book is that it's caregivers are about 60% to two-thirds women typically, and also women do more hours of care and do more taxing caregiving tasks. Like the statistics show when they do time breakdowns, there's an every 5 years survey of caregiving in America that AARP and a partner organization put out, and the statistics are really fascinating when you dig into them and kind of reveal a gendered picture of caregiving. But like in years, I'm a student. I was a student of the Victorian era, and it's not like you could go like leave, go do something else if you were a woman caring for an ill husband, or and there's literature about how people were trapped in those sorts of marriages. But to your point of like you didn't expect that sort of thing from marriage back then is also, I think, really a very good one. And I I do feel like, and I wrote about this in my book, that that a lot of the time a sense of duty and a sense of like what I owed to my spouse kept me going in ways that I regret I didn't have more empathy and underlying emotional care once I'd kind of gotten into that numb, somewhat almost robotic phase of like, I just have to put one foot in front of the other and do this. Like, I probably could have been kinder to him, to myself, to people around me. But I also, you know, it took me a long, long time to come to grips with feeling like this relationship isn't what it was, and he can like one I if he had remained as ill as he was, I'm quite sure I wouldn't have felt like I could end the relationship because when he still needed that care, I couldn't have
Hmm.
done that and abandoned him. And in fact, interestingly, like we were kind of coming out of things in 2018, 2019 when he was doing better and much more stable. And then the pandemic and the shutdown, because he was still immune compromised in 2020 and 2021, thrust us back into a really into the care dynamics that I thought we were starting to leave behind. So it added this extra level of complication just for us personally. And that's the time period when I was actually writing my book, which came out in 2021. I was continuing to work on it in the early days of 2020, which was a very strange time to be writing about care because care dynamics and politics were sort of showing up everywhere.
Imparting some lessons from all of this to our listeners, like what are the darkest thoughts that caregivers have, like the ones that you can't even speak about at the dinner table, but they originate deep from that state of suffering and anger?
I mean, I sometimes thought, like, I have a credit card right here in my purse and I'm behind the wheel of a car. I could go to the airport right now and get on a plane to Hawaii. Like, I could do that. I never did, but like that sort of like, I could just leave all this behind. And that's a level above the very darkest thoughts because we have stories and every so often you do see the shocking stories of, you know, caregivers who've given in to the very worst impulses to harm or even murder their their charges, their at some point loved ones that who've like just reached the absolute end of their rope. And I think there's some interesting like horror movies or novels or stories about that are like kind of allegorize those really, really dark impulses. And you know, obviously it doesn't need to be said that's never acceptable. But I think that some of some of those really dark impulses come from like the pain and anger of having had to drop everything in your own life for somebody else's and for feeling unseen. And also, as I kind of spoke to briefly earlier, we have this toxic positivity mindset, or this kind of, you have to keep a stiff upper lip, you have to do your best for um you have to stay positive, and not acknowledging that caregiving often will come with, you know, frustration, that it's a hard role, that it's not always going to be sunshine, that it's not always an honor and a privilege to do this for the person you love. Like I think telling somebody who's been, changing a diaper for their parent for 5 years because of, a degenerative illness is saying like it's an honor to care for them is almost insulting because there are parts of it that are an honor and there are parts of it that are a huge drag and painful and unpleasant and that you don't want to do. And like, I think being more honest about those those parts and providing more support for them and more support for people's more difficult emotions is would go a long way toward leaving behind, helping people not get to the point of having those very darkest thoughts of abandonment or harm or self-harm for that matter.
I think it's pretty fair to say that toxic positivity doesn't cure starvation.
I agree. Yeah. I particularly hated saying like ever hearing you have to stay positive because I was like, there's a lot of things I have to do, and that is definitely not one of them. Like, I can feel how I want to feel. Like, I may have to go to the hospital and sign this form, but I do not have to smile. Like,
Absolutely. Do you remember like the moment in time where that sense of connection with your partner just sort of shut off when you realized you really weren't a wife anymore? You were just a caregiver?
I don't specifically remember like one moment, but I do, it was probably in the days
Or maybe it was a season. Yeah.
I think it was the days in the wake of the transplant itself. But I mean, it ebbed and flowed at different times. All of his chemotherapy that he had done in 2015 was in the hospital over like several days at a time. So we would just be disconnected like in time and in space through a lot of his illness. But, you know, throughout his chemotherapy throughout 2015, he was still physically certainly not well, but able able to walk, able to be involved with the kids, able to parent. We had Christmas at home that year, and he surprised us all with, but we also had some different approaches to and thoughts about like how to handle the illness, how to talk to the kids about it. So we had a little bit of conflict about that as we, went through it. So we weren't always on the same page about it as we were going through it early. And then when he went into the hospital for the stem cell transplant, he was hugely optimistic that he would be home, home in a month. And I felt like I really needed to plan for a very wide variety of scenarios. And so he was the optimist, and I was, he he kind of characterized it as pessimist, and I thought of it as realist, as like, I'm the one left holding the bag if the optimism doesn't pan out. So I needed to have like a plan A, B, C, and like think about like what are all the different things. And then he got so sick so quickly after starting the they call it myeloablative chemo and
Conditioning.
radiation
Yep.
conditioning prior to the transplant to take his immune system down to zero. And he was immediately in an enormous amount of pain, very, very sick, and very, very kind of sunk into the world of being ill, very understandably. Like he was suffering terribly and, couldn't reach outside himself. We couldn't have like a conversation. I think it was at that point when I really started to feel like the only thing here is the care relationship. And it came back, it's not like that was a permanent, like there was nothing else there forever after that, but it was many, many, many months before we could even have a conversation that didn't, or where he would ask about something that had happened in my day, which like he had no responsibility to do, by the way, let me be clear, when he was sick and, tremendously suffering. But there was also a point later in 2016, because that was also a big year in the US. A lot was happening. There was a big election and all kinds of things. And I was, engaged with what was happening politically. And there was a point after like the election that year when I realized like he had not known that any of that happened. I mean, he sort of did tangentially. And I would come in and I would say something about like, oh, the nomination this, or, what happened, or like big news in the world. But he hadn't experienced any of it or experienced any of the things out in the world that were like major that I had. So it kind of like had this, you know, continual effect of, disconnection, and that we were just living quite different lives.
It's amazing how disease and defining moments that call on caregiving, they don't check future caregivers' resumes, what their skill set is, or anything. And some might listen and say, well, look, she got through it. She's got, caregivers get through it. It's not quite that straightforward. There's so much involved. There's so much uniqueness to the situation, unique to the individual, and that without a true lens on it, so much can be left behind. So many individuals can be lost, numb beyond repair, starved beyond repair, disconnected, toxic loneliness even.
Mm-hmm.
It's very humbling to listen to these stories. I think we're going to take a break right now and take some questions from our team and be back with you shortly.
So, Kate, there's this sort of movement online of preppers, and people are prepping for all kinds of things nowadays, like environmental disaster, wars, the grid going down. Is there any way to sort of prepare yourself for this level of caregiving ahead of time? If you haven't any experience, you don't have the training, is there anything you can do to sort of prep for this? Because a lot of people do find themselves as caregivers at one point in their life. The severity might be different between individual cases, but is there any way to prepare for what you went through?
I mean, I'm not sure that I would recommend that people prepare for exactly like something quite as extreme as what I went through, in the sense that like I don't want to, tell people to live in fear that that's going to be their future, their reality. But I do think that it would go a long way just culturally and for people who are future caregivers, which is most of us in one way or another are going to be caregivers or care recipients or both. Um, just to recognize that that's going to be part of the life stage and that you don't know when or where it might be coming. But, if there were more openness about the fact that there are resources, that there are advocacy organizations, that there are things you can do if you find yourself in that kind of situation, whether it's, a crisis level cancer diagnosis such as Brad had, or, a you know, long span of dementia or something like Parkinson's or something degenerative. You know, these are the illnesses of our modern society. Like, people are no longer, thankfully, dying young from childhood disease. They're living long lives, and often what takes them is it takes a lot to beat the skill of our physicians and of our hospitals and of our medicine. So people will go through more difficult diseases. I actually often reflected that, 50 years ago, this would not have happened in my family because there's no chance that Brad would have survived. He wouldn't have had the kind of treatment that he had, and there couldn't have been that, Graft-Versus-Host wouldn't have continued like that. So I think just recognizing that these challenges may be in our future, thinking about things like having, powers of attorney or, a community support in place, and being willing to ask for help and think about asking for help and networking early, before things get to the kind of crisis level that I went through. And I think that it would be great in diagnostic settings, or it's hard to say something that's one size fits all because the cases, as we spoke to earlier, are so very different. But if you're getting, I remember when Brad got his cancer diagnosis, we had kind of like an onboarding session at the cancer center. They didn't call it that, of course, but like a kind of an orientation, and he got a binder, and there were some resources in it. But, if there were also a binder for caregivers that gives more resources and offers um, a more realistic look at what may be expected, and more openness, just more generally, because caregiving so often takes place behind closed doors and it's very unsung. And part of the reason I wanted to write about it was that it took me so much by surprise that I think we need a broader cultural conversation around caregiving. That's part of what I was trying to contribute to, make sure people understand, like, this is something that shouldn't just land on every family like a grenade and a surprise, because it's happening in almost every family in one way or another. And if we're all alone soldiering through the challenges of that, we can't band together to advocate, to, commiserate, to support each other. So my answer is kind of broad, but I think it really does lie in some cultural shifts around the way we think about the challenges of care.
We're back. We're in conversation with Kate Washington, author of Already Toast. Kate, you alluded to some very important things in your book, that you were doing a lot of things right. You were following the caregiver's playbook. But why does respite sometimes actually make caregivers crash? And what does the crash feel like when you have to return back to caregiving? Is it even worth going?
I mean, I do think it's worth going. It was very, important for me. But I think respite, it's so difficult to access for many people for a lot of reasons. In complicated care situations too, often a care recipient won't accept a respite caregiver. I mean, I'm particularly thinking of like the scenario of, a crotchety older person who doesn't feel comfortable or doesn't trust anybody but the caregiver they know and have relied on for a long time. And it can be very, very difficult to kind of let go of the responsibility because, we have all taken it on. But I think that often for me to get through caregiving, I had to stuff down a lot of emotions and just kind of like power through the day. And when I had the time and space to sit with myself, those emotions would come up and they were often devastating. And one of the things that I learned in kind of more viscerally after writing the book that was kind of counterintuitive and surprising is that for a lot of caregivers, the time when they struggle the most comes when caregiving ends, either because it eases up because the care recipient has improved and is more independent, or sadly in grief and loss and like losing the death of the care recipient, and that caregivers are at the greatest risk of like high depression and anxiety and other, negative mental health challenges at that time, not when they're in the worst part of caregiving. And it's complicated. There's a lot of reasons like caregivers have also been shown to neglect their own physical health and diagnostics and things because they don't have time for that. But I think even a short respite can indeed like give you that feeling of like, oh God, I can't go back. Like it's too nice here lying in my quiet hotel room without, without this happening. And it can be a real, grind to get back to it. But I think what I would say, and like the only remedy for that, and it's so hard to do in the moment, is to do as much as you can as a caregiver to process and acknowledge and stay in touch with those emotions and be, aware of what you're going through in the moment. Like for me, I was able to continue um weekly therapy, one weekly therapy session a week. And it wasn't like I was unpacking any old issues. It was just triage of, a space for myself to express the challenges that I was dealing with in that moment. If I could go back and do it over again with what I know now, I would have tried to start even a 5 minute a day meditation practice while I was caregiving, or a self-compassion practice, which is something I've kind of read about and done a little bit more of like turning compassion on oneself, of like, don't look at the reframing, don't look at the list of things that is undone, look at the list of things that you did, and feel good about that and feel compassionate toward the challenges of what I'm going through. Because I often, even, I've described all of these difficult times and all of the pressure on me and so on, and the severity of Brad's illness. But even going through that, I often kind of thought, like, I don't have it so bad. Like, it could be worse. He could be sicker. This could be worse. I've heard of worse caregiving things. And I think we tend to discount, our own, or I was kind of tending to discount my own struggle on that, or think like, oh, it's not that bad. Like I can get through it. And I wish I'd found I had a good support network, but treated it as more of a mental health crisis for myself that I needed more, considered support in. And much later, I in order to kind of recover and process from that, and I also had some um, before Brad was ill, I cared for my mom through some mental illness, and then lost her pretty young, or younger than I certainly wanted to. And my kids were really little. One was an infant when my mom died, and so I had some grief and you know m- emotional fallout from that caregiving and that loss that I'd never really had time to process, that I was bringing into Brad's crisis. And so it was only later that I did some more intensive kind of therapeutic work to try to process all of that and work through all of those things to kind of come back from the burnout. But the effects lingered for years.
I like that idea of triaging your emotions and having a safe space with a therapist who's you've got a good working relationship. And I can imagine that was important in helping save you through the process. But
Mhm.
of the help you ever received, was there any help that was fake?
How do you mean fake? Or
Just unauthentic or just not credible, or it was just sort of like offered, or maybe help is not the right word. Maybe advice.
yeah, I mean, there was definitely some advice that was not that didn't feel that helpful. And I don't think it's fake. I think people do mean it. But one of the things that I came to dislike as a caregiver was the let me know if you need anything or what can I do for you? Because that always like threw the burden back onto me and I was already overstretched. I ended up having, people who started like a meal train so I could point them to that. But one of the things that I've taken with me into, my post intense or in between different bouts of caregiving, since I maybe will become a caregiver again at some point, but in the post caregiving period that I've been in for the last several years, one of the things that I've taken along with me is um that I, instead of asking like, how can I help you? I say, could I bring a meal next week? Could I run an errand for you next week? Or give them an option, or try to reach out to somebody who's closer to the person who's going through it than I am to ask what's really needed so that there's not the further decision fatigue of like, oh God, which day do I tell this person? Like we need to delegate even like how to support people who are in kind of that level of crisis. Cause I think sometimes those offers, very well meant, do end up being kind of the fake help. And there are a few people I remember, like the physical therapist who told me to make bone broth. Like that felt like very fake help. Like she was trying to help, but it didn't feel helpful to me. There were a few medical people that I recall sort of similarly, who would kind of give me some advice about what to do. And I was like, this is not, you don't know my life. This is not helping me. So, I try to also refrain from giving people advice now if they're in that situation.
Well, it almost sounds like help jargon, right?
Yes.
The
Yeah.
sort of thing
Yeah.
you feel you need to say, but maybe you shouldn't say anything, and
Yeah.
that silence may actually be more helpful.
Hmm.
Um, when the worst finally passed and the peak crisis period sort of took a frame shift,
Hmm.
was your body and mind still on like high alert? How do you detune all of the tuning for what you were used to and try and re-enter a next phase after caregiving?
Ooh. Um, I mean, again, I do think that if you can find like professional mental health support of some kind, like that is, and I know it's not accessible to everybody, that is really important to like guide through. Um, there's a book called Burnout that talks about like breaking the stress cycle and breaking through the stress cycle in the body and like literally releasing the stored emotions and the stored stress that build up for burnout. And so for me, doing like exercise, taking time for myself, working through things, having just reshifting how I was living my life was really important. It took me a long time to kind of move around into those things, but I think like
Mhm.
being attentive to not just trying to pick back up and go back to the life that was before because things have altered is actually really important. And I sort of surprised myself with something that I started doing I started in 2021, so quite a long time after like the real crisis time. But we were coming out of the pandemic. I was turning 50 the following year and I was like, oh, I'm so unhappy. Like, and I still feel strained and overloaded and all of these things. And like, what am I going to do? And I don't like the idea of a milestone birthday. I was kind of dreading it because I wasn't happy with like where my life was. And I decided, but I love the outdoors and the mountains and the places out in California where I'm from that I used to go when I was a kid and used to take my kids when they were little. And I decided to try to go to 50 different swimming holes or bodies of water to swim or dip or just jump in the cold water. And I did that over like a year and a half. And surprisingly, just the simple choice to do something I loved that was just for myself repeatedly. And I think there's something about the cold water too, and like and nature really helped me. And that was like that was a huge part of how I kind of found my way out of being stuck in a cycle of burnout. Because just as I'd been starting to come out of it, and, in 2018, 2019, like did some traveling, spent some more time with friends, like went on a yoga retreat, did more things with my kids, and that was helpful. And then the pandemic came and everybody got into stress and burnout, or like almost everybody I knew. And so then had a sort of second stage of reemerging from it. But that thing that I called the 50 Dunks Project ended up being kind of a big life shift unintentionally. It wasn't meant as like a big like statement, but it ended up being like, oh, this is what I love and who I am and how I keep myself happy, and like pulls me out of the mode of burnout that I'd been stuck in for literally years at that point. I'm kind of a classic like older daughter overfunctioner. So
But your message is pretty clear. It took years. It wasn't a wake up one day and then it was
Right.
years. It was actually work. It was self-compassion. It was learning the small footsteps of choosing something for you and only for you without necessarily being selfish or having your inner critic tell you you're being selfish, but just something to replenish the identity or maybe nurture it with the things that were or have always traditionally been important to you. And I can understand how that could make you feel human again.
Yeah.
Kate, do you think caregivers get post-traumatic stress disorder?
I actually do. Yes. I don't know that I'm not a diagnostician, so I can't say disorder, but I certainly think that they get
or we'll say
a
post-traumatic stress symptoms.
or symptoms. Absolutely. I think that there's increasing recognition that post-traumatic stress can also be secondary for secondary kinds of trauma. I did write about that a little bit in the book, and I'm not familiar with ongoing research, but at the time there was some research indicating and writing about that. But even just as like one small example, there are all kinds of things like just that take me back, the smell of the kind of hand sanitizer they have in the hospital. Like it'll all just go into, like my body will tense up if I smell that. Um, our washing machine used to make a little ding when it finished its cycle. And it sounded very much like the ding that an IV tower makes when when the nurse needs to come and reset it. And like both Brad and I would just flinch when that happened. I finally figured out how to turn it off. But I think there's physical returns to flight or fight based on stimuli. And I think that you could like reminders, going back to the same places, getting you can really get stuck in the cycle of remembering and being in the stress that came from that trauma. And it is traumatic to watch our loved ones suffer, especially to a very high degree. And seeing that again in your mind's eye, you can get stuck in that. And I think that there's been different kinds of there are different kinds of therapeutic and other modalities that can be really helpful for moving through that kind of trauma. I did an intensive of a therapeutic modality called DBT, but I've heard about people having a lot of success with EMDR and even with some of the psychedelic therapies. I think exploring different ways to move past that trauma and recognizing it as like, this is legitimate trauma. If you have sat bedside as I did, like I had to sit and hold my husband's hand while his eyelids were being stitched shut. It was horrible.
To protect his eyes, yeah.
Yeah. And, sometimes I see that in my mind's eye, and I there are things people should not see, and things people should not go through. The patient shouldn't, it's greater trauma for the patient, but it is still, I think, trauma for the caregiver, or can be.
Kate, professional and non-professional caregiving, family caregiving is facing, or collectively are facing, so many challenges these days. We see it in institutions, we see it in hospitals, long-term care facilities, we see it in educational systems, we We witness it in our families, but clearly we're sensing that there needs to be change. Their voices are starting to mount. We have organizations such as the AARP, which and other international caregiver alliances, et cetera, that are recognizing the footprint of caregiving, not just in America, not just in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, in other parts of the world as well, in Central and South America and Asia. We need to reach out. Policymakers need to hear the call on so many fronts. If you could change one thing in the system, or if you could call out to caregivers everywhere with your experience and craft a message to mobilize people's energy and people's thoughts so we don't get 50 signatures on a petition or on a request to a local political representative, but 500,000 signatures. What do you think would make the biggest difference?
Oh, gosh. It's hard to make one, policy type of prescription because, as we discussed, everyone's situation is unique. But I think a
What's the
recognition
building
of
block?
yes, one building block I think would be literal pay for family caregivers, and better pay and working conditions, and a caregiver's bill of rights for both family caregivers and in-home care workers of all kinds, because doing that would recognize the actual value of care, which is immense. It is, caring for each other is part of what makes us human, and it's so devalued. Pay for anyone in the caring professions is shamefully low, especially like in-home caregivers, many of whom have difficult working conditions, precarious employment, and here in the US are under all kinds of legal threats because many are undocumented immigrants are being, it's a very, very difficult landscape. And we also have, for family caregivers, a kind of flip side, that the work is literally completely unvalued. It is not valued in terms of, like, in the US, there is no universal paid family leave for people to care, so they have to actually lose money often to care for their loved ones. But there's very little any kind of like stipend or care, provision for literally compensating the caring work that people do that is saving lives. And doing that, like, not valuing in a literal way care work that then devalues the lives of like our most vulnerable fellow citizens, the very sick, the declining, the very elderly, the people who have disabilities that require a large amount of care. That devalues that in turn. And while I think we need, a cultural sea change to think about the value, one way to actually put a value on it would be to attach monetary value. We live in a society that values money, and if we support the things we actually value with money, then it becomes a virtuous cycle of building a sense of value because it's literally valued, and I think that for me, caregiver pay and caregiver rights would be places to start in hopes that the cultural change can follow. And I know that, the landscape here is, particularly dire in some ways, and there are many places around the world that are doing better by caregivers and thinking more holistically about how families and people can care for each other in ways that are truly valued. And it doesn't necessarily have to be money. It can be care networks, it can be other kinds of support. But money is a very obvious way to say, like, we value this because that is the thing in our society we've all agreed has value is money. So
And for friends and family of caregivers who might be listening now, who are witnessing the beginning of a journey in caregiving for someone they love or they know, what would be the advice you would give them as friends and family of caregivers about one or two things they can do today that can help meaningfully?
Yeah, offer a specific kind of help. Send a text or a phone call of saying that even just recognizing what somebody is going through. One little kind of trick or thing that I always now do or like to say about, if you're reaching out to a caregiver who you know is overburdened, say, no need to respond if you're overwhelmed, but I was just thinking of you, you know, and then offer some kind of practical or emotional assistance. Um, you know, some of the things that I remember, like some gestures seem so small or so, you know, quirky, but can be the things that like really change somebody's day or somebody's week. I remember when Brad first started chemotherapy, he had horrible taste changes, so he couldn't tolerate any metal utensils. And a dear friend, like all of a sudden, a package appeared on my front porch, and it was 500 compostable plastic utensils, like spoons and forks that he could use that had no taste. And it was something that I would have never, thought to go out and buy for myself, or couldn't have like mustered that. He was just sort of suffering with that. But that kind of like seeing, I'd told her that that was a struggle for him eating, and she saw that need and kind of filled it. And that was, just one thing that particular friend did for me. But another friend, our younger daughter was 6 years old, and her best friend's parents, when Brad was really ill, said, "Bring Lucy over every Sunday, no questions asked. We will look after her all day." And you can still hear that more than 10 years later, I cannot talk about that without choking up. So offering something and saying, like, feel free to decline, but can I do this for you, is so powerful and can really change somebody else's experience. There's even things like I had friends who would text and say like, "Hey, I'm going to Costco. Is there something I can pick up for you? If so, I'll leave it on your porch. If not, no need to respond." That is a kindness that is, send a letter, send a card, send the text, and don't worry too much about saying the wrong thing, because nobody in our culture ever really quite knows the right things to say in times of grief and
Mhm.
difficulty, because we're kind of bad as a culture at facing that. But the outreach and the kindness is something that people who are, in a challenging place with that will not forget.
I think we survive with micro moments of connection, no matter what caregiving hat we wear. But at the same time, recognizing that it may be just a horrendous day. And if that text or that outreach doesn't get answered, it doesn't mean the caregiver is blowing you off or isn't receptive to hearing you reach out another day. But maybe it was just the worst day yet and they couldn't get back to you. But
Mhm.
I guess to those friends and family, don't give up. Not hearing back doesn't mean no one's interested. Keep at it.
Yeah, agreed.
Kate Washington, thank you so much today for joining us and for the honesty and the language you brought to the conversation, a conversation that so many people keep inside, living in silence. For anyone who wants to go deeper into learning about Kate's journey and the climate and the situation of where caregiving stood at the time and where it situates itself today, please do check out her book. It's an amazing read. I really did enjoy it, and it's captivating and certainly got great reviews in its time. And do check out her website, and we'll be happy to put the links for Already Toast in the show notes. Thank you for today. Thank you for your time, your generosity of spirit, and we wish you the best in the next phase of your journey.
Thank you so very much.
Kate Washington, thank you so much today for your honesty and for giving a language to what so many people keep deep inside, living in silence. For anybody who wants to explore Kate's story, we've linked her website as well as the link to her book, Already Toast. Stay tuned for her upcoming book, released this July, coming up. And thank you for being here today. We'll see you next time at the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production. It's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.